Welcome back. You are listening to Nate the Hate on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And with that, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, Modern Vintage Gamer.
Hello, Nate. Man, it's great to be back. We have been gone for a little bit, but I'm happy we're back. I know I had GDC and then I got sick and then you got sick and there's been all sorts of things going on, but I'm very happy that we're back together and yeah, we got some stuff to talk about.
We do. I mean, we've been gone so long that you entered a new decade of life.
I know. You're right. You're absolutely right about that.
Out of your 40s and into your 50s.
I know. I had to wait a whole decade. Almost.
Hey, but good things come to those who wait. And hopefully this return episode to kick off the month of May will be worth the wait. And with that, I'd like to dedicate this episode to the Zelda Sensei, whom generously donated $100 to support the channel. And if you have any questions that you would like us to answer, you can donate any dollar amount, ask a question to our Streamlabs link in the description below. We will answer it at the end of the episode. And if you donate $100 or more, we will dedicate the episode to you. And today's episode, once again, is dedicated to the Zelda Sensei. And today's topic is going to be about Tears of the Kingdom. And I want to talk about the sales potential that Tears of the Kingdom presents. This is Nintendo's best-selling hardware, so naturally people are going to expect huge sales from the flagship franchise that is the Legend of Zelda. And Tears of the Kingdom looks to be potentially one of the swan songs for the Switch, but hype is high. Mm-hmm. It has a lot of anticipation. However, when you look at historic trends, which we're going to do, of Zelda games in a single console generation, it doesn't look that good for Tears of the Kingdom when it comes to outselling its predecessor. And we're going to explore that and whether or not we think Tears of the Kingdom will outsell Breath of the Wild. Now, Breath of the Wild is the best-selling Zelda game of all time.
Easily the best-selling Zelda game of all time.
Yeah, it is magnitudes higher than second place at this point. Mm-hmm. It is just shy of 30 million copies sold on the Switch. Now, with the Wii U version combined, it is over 30 million, but that's a different console, so we're not including that here. So 30 million is nothing to scoff at.
Definitely not.
However, when we go back to the NES, The Legend of Zelda was born. And the first entry sold 6.51 million on the NES. Then the sequel came out, Zelda 2: Link's Awakening, and sales declined to 4,000,038. Not a radical decline, but still a decline. Then we went to the N64, where you had Ocarina of Time, sold 7.6 million.
The GOAT.
It is the GOAT, arguably, still the best Zelda game ever made. And then it had a sequel, which was Majora's Mask. That sold 3.36 million. Now, over time, I'd say history has been kind to Majora's Mask, where people will argue that it may have been superior to Ocarina of Time in many ways.
Just on that real quick, and I know this is not the focus of this episode, but I never really connected with Majora's Mask the way I did with Ocarina of Time. I felt like it started out in a way that just didn't really connect with me, and I never really got into the game. And I know people are probably going to come at me for that. I get it, but I can see why it probably didn't reach the heights of Ocarina of Time in terms of sales. I know people love Majora's Mask, and I think it's a great game in its own right, no question about it.
Yeah, and that's going to be something that we're going to touch on in just a couple of minutes, actually. So then we go to the GameCube, and we had Wind Waker. It sold just shy of 4.5 million copies. And then we had Twilight Princess, and it sold 1.43 million. Now, those numbers are skewed slightly because Twilight Princess was a cross-generation game where it launched also on the Wii, and it was about a month after the Wii version came out when it came to GameCube. So those aren't fully accurate in the sense of what the game could have potentially sold had a Wii version not come to market. Then we go to the Wii, where you had Twilight Princess, which was a launch game,
Mhm.
and it sold 7.26 million copies. And then as the Wii began to age and it approached its end, we had Skyward Sword. And Skyward Sword sold 3.67 million copies on the Wii. And that brings us to Switch, where we have Breath of the Wild at 29 million copies. As of the last report, we will get updated figures in just over a week. Now, when I look at these sales and I look at the releases, each sequel differed from its predecessor in a number of ways. You can look at Link's Awakening, a radically different approach from the original Legend of Zelda game, where it was this big open world and it became kind of this 2D side-scrolling odd game.
Mm-hmm.
Like Link's Awakening is definitely the odd duck the Zelda franchise.
I don't know. Maybe I think about Link's Awakening a little differently, but the way that I think about Link's Awakening, Nate, is that we haven't talked about Link to the Past, of course, right? Because the SNES only had one Zelda game, but I've always kind of felt like you kind of group together Link to the Past and Link's Awakening as kind of this bite-sized experience on the Game Boy that has a lot of similarities with Link to the Past. Do you think is that a fair thing to say? That's the way I've always kind of thought about it when I think about Link's Awakening, I guess. You think that's accurate?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Because I think when Link to the Past came out, it was a pretty big seller for Nintendo, and then they kind of dropped Link's Awakening on the Game Boy, and it was like, wow, this is amazing. And a lot of people actually prefer Link's Awakening over Link to the Past. I personally think that Link to the Past is probably the best Zelda game in its franchise history. We haven't seen Tears of the Kingdom yet, of course, and my opinions may change on that, but yeah, I've always felt like Link's Awakening was a little bit of an outlier as well, but I've always liked to group that together with Link to the Past, I guess.
Yeah, they do have similarities, and I misspoke. I got the name of the second Zelda wrong. It's The Adventure of Link.
Oh, yeah. Not Link's Awakening. Yep.
Yeah, and The Adventure of Link, it's it's a very different game from its predecessor.
Yeah,
and that trend continued.
That's interesting because that 2D side-scrolling Zelda game, I think it was a really good game, but I'm not sure if it connected with people in the way that Nintendo were looking for as well. But that was also a long time ago.
Right. Yeah. And then we go to the N64 where we had Ocarina of Time, and then you went to Majora's Mask. It's a very different game. It had the time mechanic. You're in a new setting. You had some returning characters, but this was clearly a different Zelda game from its predecessor. And I think that's what led to a very mixed reception. Not everyone was sold on that time mechanic of, it resets after 3 days.
Right.
And all of that. It was a very, I don't want to say convoluted approach to gaming, but you had people who could play Ocarina of Time, and it was just a standard, awesome, epic 3D adventure, to now something that was more puzzle driven. And, it turned off some people because it was a more complex, indirect game than its predecessor. So perhaps that's why you saw sales decline. But also it was towards the tail end of the N64. The Dreamcast was coming out. The PS2 was, looming just over the horizon. That hunger and thirst for new hardware was there. We saw glimpses of what the future could be.
Yes.
And we were playing Majora's Mask in I believe it was 2000.
Right.
So, it was one of those cases of, as the hardware begins to reach its end, people are looking forward to what's next. And you bring out a major sequel that you do see declines in sales. And I would say, that was reflective definitely on the GameCube, where you had Wind Waker, a very controversial release in its own right, often dubbed Zelda due to the cel-shaded graphics.
Man, do you remember when all that went down back in the day? People were mad.
Yes.
People were mad online.
We saw the Space World demo where we had realistic looking Link fighting Ganondorf, and then all of a sudden, here's the next entry to Zelda, and you got this goofy looking kid Link who's smiling at the camera looking like a Looney Tune, and it was like, wait, what is this? And I mean, for Nintendo, you were going up against Xbox, that at the time it had Halo, which was a cultural phenomenon. It had Ninja Gaiden. You had the PS2. These were both those more core adult systems, and Nintendo was still the purple lunchbox.
Right.
And in comes cartoony Zelda.
Which I mean, it turned out to be an absolute masterpiece. Don't get me wrong, but dude, I remember at the time. I mean, obviously there was no Twitter back then, but imagine if there was, right? Like, I feel like the outrage would have been just as bad as what we see with some things that are going on social media these days. But yeah, Wind Waker was definitely a departure, but it was a controlled experiment which paid dividends for them. It was fantastic.
Yeah, the game's definitely received a lot of love over the years, and it's viewed very favorably now. But at the time, yeah, a lot of vitriol. There was not a lot of appreciation for the game. It took Nintendo a lot of time, a lot of trailers and gameplay demonstrations to show people why they went with this visual style, to show that emotion in Link and have those, facial expressions and everything. And it eventually did come into its own. And then to follow Wind Waker, we had Twilight Princess, a return to the more adult, grown up, darker, approach to the Zelda franchise.
Yeah.
And yes, the sales declined on the GameCube, but it was largely because of the Wii version, and the Wii had all the hype. People wanted to use the grapple shot by pointing at the screen. They wanted to swing the sword like Link. So it's tough to use a comparison there as to say, did the change impact anything to lead to lower sales? It's clearly just due to new hardware was the reason there. But then you look at the Wii, where Twilight Princess sold well over 7 million copies. And then you had the successor, Skyward Sword, which took that motion and that immersion of being a Link even further with the gyro swinging and everything. And the game, sold just around 50% of what its predecessor did. And, this was at a stage where people were ready to move on from the Wii. They were tired of waggle controls, as they were dubbed, and the controls were inconsistent. If you had too much sunlight on your TV, you would have to resync and recalibrate. And, the game was just a struggle to really sit down and play. And in terms of game design, when you had Skyrim come out right around the same time, it felt outdated compared to games coming out at the exact same month.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think there's definitely something to be said about launch Zelda games that are launch titles for new hardware as well, because they not only sell systems, they sell themselves as well. Twilight Princess sold a lot on the Wii when it came out. Obviously, Breath of the Wild has done the same for the Switch as well. And yeah, I mean, if you have a new piece of hardware, new Nintendo hardware with a Zelda game day and date when the system comes out, millions and millions and millions of people are buying that system and getting that game. I mean, when I got my Switch, the only game I got was Breath of the Wild. I know you probably got ARMS and snipper clips and whatever else you picked up, Nate. I only got Breath of the Wild, and I played it literally for a month, and I beat it, and I loved it. And I think a lot of people would have done the same thing at the time.
Yeah, when I picked up my Switch day one, I got Breath of the Wild. I had Bomberman.
Oh yeah, Bomberman. Yeah, that old chestnut.
Yeah, Fast Racing RMX. Because it just looked like a phenomenal game. I also had Shovel Knight. The what was the expansion that came out as a standalone game? I can't think of the knight's name right now.
I don't remember.
But yeah, I mean,
not Shovel Knight Dig, was it?
No, it was game with an S.
I don't know.
It was kind of like the more actiony knight that you fought against in the original Shovel Knight, like Scepter or something. I can't recall its name. But yeah, I mean, Breath of the Wild at a time was selling more Switch copies than Switch hardware was selling. And I mean, think of that fact. How could you sell more games than hardware? But that was happening.
Right.
And we're now 6 years later. It has sold just shy of 30 million, very likely will eclipse 30 million at the next earnings report. And now we're looming with the launch of Tears of the Kingdom. And it replicates a lot of these past Zelda games. It's coming on at the tail end of the console generation.
I mean, let's be real about this. This is the Switch's swan song, right? I mean, there may be a couple of other things here and there. I mean, obviously Pikmin 4 is coming, and Metroid Prime 4, wherever the hell that is. We don't know yet. But you got to think that this is it now, right?
It's gearing up.
Yeah, I mean, the sun is it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun's starting to set. But we're not there yet. Like we're not there for a while, but I feel like we're getting close.
Yeah, the Requiem isn't playing just yet, but they are beginning to tune the organ.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a nice bookend of the whole generation. You started with Breath of the Wild. I'm not saying you're ending with Tears of the Kingdom, because you're not, but it's one of those games that's going to close out the generation, I would say.
Yeah, it's probably the last great epic.
Yes.
From Nintendo, and that will be how they close out this generation. And yeah, it is poetic in that sense. And now it's just one of those cases of, will it buck the trend? Will this be the first Zelda game to outsell its predecessor on a very successful platform? And when I think about, does it have that potential? My immediate instinct is history tells me no. And we have to look to history to learn for what the future can present. So my expectations, just based on historic trends, would be it's going to sell well. I don't think it's going to follow these trends exactly, where we see some of these games selling, in the range of only 50 to 60% what its predecessor did. I think that percentage will be considerably higher. I think, 80, 90%. But one thing that I haven't considered until now is that one of the key mechanics to Tears of the Kingdom is that crafting ability, is the freedom to create. And now we have very popular games out there with children and young teens with Minecraft and Roblox. And if streamers go to Tears of the Kingdom and they just create, they show you weapons, vehicles, whatever you can create in the game.
Yeah.
Will that bring in that young audience who may not have played Breath of the Wild, may never have had interest in a Zelda game before now because of that creation aspect?
I think it will, based on the preview events that we've seen and what Nintendo has shown us of the game. The crafting and mechanics in the game, the ultra hand, I think it's called, and the fuse ability where you can kind of fuse different weapons together. But I think what we're talking about here is the building side, which is the ultra hand stuff.
Yes.
That, for me, looks very accessible. And based on what I've seen, the way that it works, as far as how you do it, it seems very accessible and very easy to kind of just put a whole bunch of things together and make some amazing looking creations. I mean, we saw glimpses of, like, we saw that first kind of gameplay trailer where they were showing us kind of, they basically fused together a boat and things like that. But since then, we've seen a couple of other snippets of some really more advanced looking creations. So I think you're right. I think there's definitely something to be said about this game, Tears of the Kingdom, being aimed at it's a Zelda game. There's always going to be a younger generation of playing this game because it's so accessible. It always has been. But I think you're right. I think there's definitely a market for people that just want to create shit. They just want to make stuff. They don't, sure, they want to play the game and enjoy it, but like they also want to spend hours and hours and hours just running around, finding the right pieces and building something really cool and then, showing it off or whatever. Now, we don't know anything about the game on that aspect. Is there a way to like share your creations with other people, like all that sort of stuff? We'll find out when the game comes out. But like, I think you're right. The creation side, there's definitely some kind of shades of Minecraft and Roblox here, where a younger generation or a younger audience can pick this game up and just kind of build things and have a lot of fun with it. So I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right on that one.
Yeah, that's definitely a market I hadn't really considered until now. And, when we went from Breath of the Wild, it came out, a lot of people bought into it based on the hype, the promise of this is going to be the new vision for the Zelda games. And there is a reasonable percentage of people who played Breath of the Wild, hate it.
Yes.
Like outright hate it,
Mm-hmm.
looked at Tears of the Kingdom and said, this is more of the same.
Yep.
I am not buying this game. And, that's individuals' personal opinions. A lot of it is just, this wasn't a traditional Zelda game. I want to go back to traditional. I want traditional dungeons. I want traditional progression just in that open setting. And they're not getting that here. So naturally, that's already a sales decline. But if you are able to cater to this younger audience who never played Breath of the Wild, who's into creating, and they watch the streamers who just focus on that aspect, it could make up that decline of those individuals and potentially, eclipse that percentage exponentially just due to that curiosity factor.
Right.
So that is something that you now have to consider when it comes to sales predictions and expectations with this game. And another thing that people definitely have to weigh are the vouchers, which just came back to North America.
Mm-hmm.
And with Tears of the Kingdom being a $70 game, the first $70 game that Nintendo has published on the Switch, that will also impact sales. And this could be negatively or potentially positively if you are a digital consumer.
Right.
With the voucher system, it's $100. You get 2 vouchers. So it's good for 2 games that are part of the program. Well, typically these games are $60. Now you have a $70 game. Nintendo has effectively created a buy one, get one 50% off.
Yes.
Getting Tears of the Kingdom for $70 with one of these vouchers, man, that sounds like a deal, because after tax and such, the game's going to come up to about $75 depending on your state and what the sales tax and everything is. So $25 for a full price $60 game like Pikmin 4, Advance Wars, man, that sounds like a bargain if you are a digital consumer. Now, it does no good if you do not like digital games. And that's where, will the $70 price tag, in your opinion, negatively impact the game's sales potential?
I think it will. However, I don't think it's going to impact it that much. But I do think that the $10 price increase will negatively affect the sales of the game. But to your point, I do think that potentially that Roblox / Minecraft, thing that we just talked about could just kind of stomp all over that $70 price increase, honestly. But look, as a consumer, as someone that has pre-ordered the game for $70, I was initially a little confused, I will say, as to why. But look, at the end of the day, I think Zelda fans, and there are a lot of them out there, are going to buy this game no matter what. They may not like the $70 game or the $70 price, but they're still going to buy the game anyway, right? But I guess the $1 million question is, what percentage of people are going to just give it a miss? Not because it's $70 and they refuse to buy it, but they're just, for whatever reason, like basically what we've seen with historical data, that the sequels don't tend to sell as well as kind of the launch title, right? I don't think it's going to be that significant, but there will be some percentage that I think ultimately don't pick up this game. But
yeah, I mean,
pretty tiny, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, with the Switch, we are nearing that end, as we mentioned. People are looking forward to new hardware. People who played Breath of the Wild who didn't like it are, unlikely to invest in this new game. There are going to be individuals who see the $70 price tag and say, I'm not buying this game for $70.
Yeah, and just on that real quick, I mean, I think Nintendo has tried to market the new abilities in the game as accessibility options for those that didn't like some of the aspects of Breath of the Wild. Obviously, Fuse is something that is there to appease the people that didn't like the breakable weapons, because that was very polarizing. I feel like that whole mechanic. And things like Ascend, allows you to traverse up through hills and stuff. Go vertical a lot easier, I guess. So I think they're doing all the right things to make this game more accessible. And I know someone personally that's a big Zelda fan, Nate, that didn't like Breath of the Wild, hated the destructible weapons, basically just rage quit and said, I can't play this game. I can't deal with this. And they really appreciate what Nintendo's doing with Tears of the Kingdom, and they've pre-ordered the game. So I think that's what Nintendo is looking for. They want people that didn't connect with Breath of the Wild to jump on. And I think there's going to be a percentage of people that didn't like Breath of the Wild that are going to play Tears of the Kingdom and potentially enjoy it for what it is, because it's, at least from what we've seen, is a much more open and accessible game than Breath of the Wild, which, you know, is a fantastic game. But it's also one that does require, you know, your attention. And this game is a lot more open, and I feel like, you know, it's going to be there for people that maybe were on the fence or didn't like the original Breath of the Wild. They're going to pick this game and enjoy it, and I think that's Nintendo's hope.
Yeah, I think word of mouth is definitely going to play a fairly significant factor here for those on the fence. They're going to want to see review coverage. They're going to want to see, you know, have dungeons returned, at least in some form, that they get that, you know, traditional hit that maybe they're seeking, or they want to find out more about the narrative. How much story content is there? Is it going to be similar to Breath of the Wild, where I have to search out memories, or is the story actually delivered in a cohesive manner similar to other games out there on the market? And, you know, how's the structure of the game going to be? Because right now, yeah, we've seen some of the previews, we have seen the trailers, but we still don't know exactly how that's going to be delivered. And you can only learn that once you actually play the game for yourself,
right?
Or you see, you know, gameplay online after the game is released. So there's definitely things that are going to come from positive word of mouth or negative word of mouth that's going to affect that longevity. Because when you look at Breath of the Wild, the game has sold consistently well since 2017. It's always moving, you know, 1 million plus every single fiscal quarter for Nintendo. And to have that evergreen appeal will play a significant role in Tears of the Kingdom's long-lasting sales effect, which, you know, that remains to be seen. That's something that we would have to look back on in, you know, the future years, and we can't talk to our future selves and find out. But right now, do you think Nintendo, with its marketing, has been effective in being able to convince individuals that Tears of the Kingdom is worth the $70 price tag?
I think so. In general, I think they have been effective. You know, initially when the $70 price kind of leaked, well, it wasn't even a leak. It was just kind of, you know, pushed out there, right? And everyone was like, well, what is this? And there was no real official statement made. People were asking, this is a mistake. And we found out that it was not a mistake. And people were like, well, why are you giving us this game for $70, which is a Switch game? It's not doing anything kind of special. It's not running on new hardware. There's no new features, right? Like I always believe that if you're going to charge $70 for a game, then it needs to be on updated hardware. I mean, we've seen that with Xbox Series and PlayStation 5. $70 games are kind of the normal standard. So it was a little puzzling for me to wrap my head around the $70 price tag. And I will also say that I do want to reserve judgment whether $70 makes sense once I get the game in my hands and start playing it. But however, based on the previews that we've seen, based on all the information that they've given us, based on the fact that this game seems to be a lot more ambitious, larger in scope, more systems are in the game, and could potentially be the very best Zelda game ever made, I do think, and I'm putting an asterisk next to this, I do think it's worth $70. But again, I want to reserve judgment until we actually play the game and maybe have spent like 10 hours each playing the game, and we can revisit this topic. But at this time, I would say tentatively, yes, it's worth the money. What do you think?
I mean, I think that's a fair answer. I mean, the thing with the $70 is you can look at other games that have come out, even in just recent history. You can look at the Resident Evil 4 remake and say this was a $60 game from Capcom. look at the visual fidelity, look at the changes they made, look at the ambition that was in that game. And you can easily counter that saying, yeah, but Tears of the Kingdom does this, 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 and this.
Right.
And I do believe, based on some of the things I've been told and what I've heard, is that the reason Tears of the Kingdom is a $70 game isn't due to the ambition, isn't due to the scope of the game. It's that Nintendo is using a 32 gigabyte game card, and they said, we could give it to you at $60, but that's going to hurt our bottom line a little bit.
Sure.
And you know what? We know you'll pay $70 for it. And we can just say, this is the most ambitious Zelda game ever made. And you feel like you're getting a steal. It's them using more expensive storage solution. And they don't want to lose their revenue.
Oh, they never lose. Never lose. Any business that turns, profits year on year, they always want to make money. They never want to lose. So I get it. It makes sense.
And I did have some figures that were roughly the game card cost from, I believe it was late 2021. So they're not necessarily indicative of what it would cost Nintendo now. So I'm not going to cite them because the prices would also differ slightly. I believe they would be about 30% cheaper than the figures I have due to the licensing fees that Nintendo would charge partners and such. But just as a rough estimate, a 32 gigabyte game card back then for a third party partner was in the area of $20 to $25. I mean, that's substantial money. So for Nintendo, it would have came in closer to, like $18.
Right.
So let's say it's down to $10 now. The exact price increase.
There you go. That is interesting to think about.
I mean, that's the thing. They can get away with it because they're attaching it to a game that is going to sell well, and they can just say, look at all the cool new things we added to the game. And people can say, yeah, you justified the price to us, even though they're sitting there saying, we could have sold this for $60 and no one would have cared. It wasn't because it was in development for 6 years and the budget was high. It was would I rather sell 10 million copies at $60 and lose $10 on each copy, or sell 10 million copies at $70 and say, you made a lot more money?
I mean, we know the answer to that. And look, we already touched on it. There are diehard Zelda fans, and there are millions and millions of them that are going to buy this game no matter what. They could have charged $100 for it. Sure, there'd be outrage, but ultimately people are going to just be like, yep, I want to play that game. I want to buy that game. So honestly, Nintendo could have offered any amount of money for this game, and people would have bought it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll go back to the game card price playing a role here. We kind of talked about it a long time ago, going back to, the N64, Super NES days, even going back to the DS and 3DS, when I believe it was Capcom on the 3DS, they brought Resident Evil Revelations, and they said, we have to charge, I believe it was $10 or $15 more than the standard 3DS game because of the game card cost.
Right.
And there was some backlash at the time, but we've discussed, hey, if Nintendo does come out with, a 32 gigabyte or a 64 gigabyte game card, and the games are on it just to guarantee the full game is on it, and it was going to cost you $75, $80, $85, would you be willing to spend that money knowing you don't have to have an additional download? And there were some people saying, yes, I would, just for that convenience. No, I don't have to rely on servers in the future. And I have the game right there at all times on the game card. And that's just playing into that here. And, if the game is quality and it can justify the $70 price tag, then, there's really no issue here. And this is very likely a glimpse of what is to come for the future when Nintendo does come out with new hardware. That $70 will be the standard. We've seen it from Microsoft and Sony and third parties that they want to make that push for $70. And if they can hold that price for a long period of time, especially Nintendo, who rarely gives permanent price drops to their games, if they can hover at that $70 price point, and even if they discount it to $60 at some point in the future, and that seems like a bargain.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, they're kind of dipping their toes into the $70 market with this. And I think what they'll find is it's going to be very successful for them. But look, not every game you know, is of the scope and magnitude of of Tears of the Kingdom. I'm sorry,
Right.
and not every game is gonna need a 32 gigabyte cartridge.
Correct.
So, and I think Nintendo's messaging was selected games will have that $70 price where they kind of choose to do that. So I don't know if it's going to be an overarching increase. I mean, I think it's fair to say when new hardware comes, I'll probably just increase the price to 70 because that's what the market's doing right now. But I think on the Switch, honestly, Nate, I'd probably say that. I mean, I don't think Pikmin 4 is going to be $70, and Metroid Prime 4, if and when that ever comes, do you think that's going to be a $70 game? I would be surprised if it is.
I'm expecting that this is the sole Nintendo published $70 game for this generation, because I've looked at some of the historic 32 gigabyte games up to this point, and there's very few. And it's also important to note that the $70 price tag, or we'll say $69.99 with any currency, that was the standard for Breath of the Wild in all regions outside of North America.
Yeah.
This is the first time that we've seen that for a Nintendo game, whereas Breath of the Wild was essentially $70 in other regions.
Mm-hmm.
So this could be Nintendo also just, it's the game card cost element, it's the inflation, it's, all these other factors where they just said, we're going to do it.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
I think
if you're going to do it, Zelda is the game to do it.
Yeah.
So that makes
sense.
Now,
let's talk about first week sales.
Okay.
When you factor in everything we've gone, historic trends, maybe Minecraft and Roblox having that creation element, positive word of mouth, also negative word of mouth, the $70 price tag, the voucher system, those who just have no interest in the sequel because they didn't like Breath of the Wild. Where do you think first week sales could come in for Tears of the Kingdom? And you can look at recent Nintendo releases like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which opened at 10 million copies in just a few days of release.
Yep.
Where do you think Tears of the Kingdom is going to come in?
I think it's this is a tough question. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I will say that I think it's probably going to do about the same as Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I think it's going to knock out 10 million pretty quickly in the first week, maybe more, maybe just a touch higher than Pokemon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking anywhere between 10 to 12 million. It's just going to sell like absolute hotcakes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the thing that Nintendo needs to kind of think about is what the middle part looks like and what the tail looks like. But I think it's going to sell a lot of units very, very quickly. I mean, everyone that I know has pre-ordered this game. You have a pre-order. I have a pre-order. Everyone, I think, on the Spawncast that we know, or everyone has a pre-order, right? So I mean, that alone tells you the amount of the hooks that Zelda has in people, right? Like, we're all going to play it, and I think it's gonna just come out of the gate with a lot of momentum. It's probably going to do between 10 to 12 in the first week, and then we'll see. But I'm not a sales guy. I'm not a numbers guy like you are. So you tell me what you think, and you tell me if I'm way off base here. What do you got?
I think your first week estimates are going to be what we see. I mean, when we take in account the install base and
it's about 10%,
all of those
right?
types of factors
in the first week, 10% in the install. That kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah, about 10% would come in between 10 and 12 million. And when you look at that, and you have to figure, I hate to use Metroid as the example, but like Metroid Dread, the Metroid base showed up on launch.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted the game. They bought it as soon as it came out.
Yep.
And unlike Dread, the Zelda series it's not just going to, flatline immediately after it launched.
No,
there's still going to be a lingering effect.
Right.
So you're going to have that core Zelda fan base show up day one. So those initial sales are going to be sky high, 10, 12 million. I don't think we're reaching, a figure of 15 million. That would just be astonishing. But yeah, low end, I would go at about 10. 12 is definitely the high end. I wouldn't dismiss the possibility of even like 8 million as an extreme low.
Mm-hmm.
But the first week, yeah, anywhere in that range, that 4 million figure range of 8 to 12. But now, like the first month, so we'll say, yeah, the entirety of May, where do you think we will be sitting then if we open between, 10 and 12? You figure maybe 16?
I think 16 to 18 would be where I see this going. I think it depends on the first week. Like you're right, Nate.
Mm-hmm.
We're expecting it to sell a lot in the first week. But what if it does less than 10 million? What if it does 8 million? Then all of a sudden, hitting 18 million in the first month is a lot more aggressive, I think, to get to that number. But I'm going to stick to my guns and say it's probably going to sell over 10 in the first week, and it's probably going to be about 16 to 18 after the first month.
So I'm going to come in a little lower than that for the first month. I think we're going to be, if we open at 12, I think we're going to be hovering about 14.5, 15 for the first month. And then when we come to the end of the fiscal year, I think we're going to be around 18 to 20 when we get to March of 2024, which would bring it, just about 10 million shy of where Breath of the Wild is now. But that is still those are mammoth sales.
Yep.
These aren't sales, to sneeze at. Any company would die to have sales like that for their, premier games. I just don't know if it's going to have that evergreen effect that Breath of the Wild had, because you know what you're getting. If you are a Zelda fan, you're going to buy this game as soon as it comes out. You're not waiting. Whereas Breath of the Wild was the game you bought when you got a Switch.
Yes.
Tears of the Kingdom, you pick up because you already have a Switch. So the interested base already has that hardware. So you're going to show up on the onset. You're not going to show up, in December or November of this year, because you're not. What are you waiting for? Right. You want to buy this game right away. You want to be part of the conversation in that first month. So I feel like this is going to be more front loaded than what we saw with Breath of the Wild. And we've definitely seen this with other Nintendo games released very recently. Splatoon 3 was very front loaded. Its sales have kind of tapered off when you look at Japanese charts or even the North American NPD charts. It didn't retain as strongly as Splatoon 2. Pokemon, meanwhile, just continues to hold on to those charts, but that is the strength of Pokemon. It just sells forever. So
I mean, I guess the other question is, and I don't want to talk about new hardware because, man, I'm tired of talking about new Nintendo hardware. But let me try to phrase this in a way that makes sense, because Nintendo doesn't want to, and I don't think Nintendo is going to announce new hardware for a while. So please don't misunderstand me, but I think Nintendo has to be very careful, right? That they allow the appropriate amount of time for Tears of the Kingdom to sell as much as possible and make sure that it has an appropriate tail where it continues to sell. And I think they will, because once Nintendo announces new hardware, then the focus has switched. And no pun intended, right? But the focus has changed to whatever's next. And people all of a sudden may be thinking to themselves, well, maybe I'm just going to wait, Maybe they'll put this game on new hardware, which, look, there's a lot of rumors and speculation that they will. And maybe that's the thing, maybe it does outsell Breath of the Wild, but it takes kind of 2 console generations for it to do so. We've seen that happen with, Breath of the Wild on the Wii U and the Switch. It's possible a similar thing could happen here, although we would expect that if it does land on new hardware, then that particular version would not sell as much as what we expect it to sell on the Switch. But maybe it's the combination of 2 hardware platforms. But I guess going back to my original question, how long do you think Nintendo kind of markets Tears of the Kingdom without disturbing the landscape of any potential new hardware announcements that I don't know when we expect that to happen. Maybe next year, maybe towards the end of this year. I don't know. But do you see what I'm saying? What do you think about that?
I mean, as we kind of talked about in January, my speculation and personal expectation of new hardware from Nintendo is fall of 2024.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking, another 18 months from now.
Right. So basically, go the entire fiscal without any announcements of new hardware and focus on getting as many sales as possible. I mean, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. That the focus is still switched. This is where we want you to buy Tears of the Kingdom. We're not alluding to anything that's going to give you better performance or visuals or anything like that. If you want to play Tears of the Kingdom, play it now on this hardware available.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to hint, tease, allude to anything on the horizon. Play the game now if you want to play it. Don't assume that we're going to give you something with backwards compatibility or that we're going to remaster the game. Though it's obvious that if Nintendo can sell you Tears of the Kingdom twice, they will do so.
Do it. Yeah, they've done it many times before, and it's been successful, and they will continue to do so.
Yeah, if they have that opportunity, they will gladly take advantage of that chance, and they will make a lot of money on the game a second time around. But yeah, I would expect nothing this year that's going to hinder Tears of the Kingdom's sales performance in terms of, can I play it on better hardware in the near future, as far as official messaging goes. And I mean, that's going to be the interesting thing, is just how is it going to, as you said, what is the tail going to be? Is this going to be front loaded, or is it going to be one of those consistent sellers where in every region it's selling 250, 300,000 units a month?
Mm-hmm.
Just below, some of those sale charts, because it's a slow sale. Yeah. And all of a sudden it creeps up and it's like, wow, it's all of a sudden at 31 million sales and it just outsold Breath of the Wild.
Could easily happen. Easily could.
Yeah. And to go to like the main topic at hand, will Tears of the Kingdom outsell Breath of the Wild in your opinion?
Wow. Well, based on everything we've said, based on historical data, which I think is very interesting, because I wasn't really aware that, I guess, I'll call them sequels, right? Like, they're not all sequels, but basically Zelda games on the same platform. Generally speaking, the second game hasn't done as well, and in some cases, less than half, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that Tears of the Kingdom is going to only sell, 15 million, because that's absurd to say that. It's going to sell a lot. I think it's going to be neck and neck with Breath of the Wild, Nate. But honestly, I think it's not going to reach 30 million. I think it's going to get close. I think it's probably going to be 25, 26, 27, maybe 28. But I don't think it's going to quite get there. I think everything we've talked about, the $70 price tag, the fact that this is the one of the swan songs of the Switch hardware. I talk to people that are like, I'm waiting for the next Nintendo hardware. Like there's a lot of people out there that have heard stories, or they've read the Bloomberg reports and they've read stuff about there's new hardware coming, right? Even though nothing has been announced and probably won't be announced until next year, as we've discussed. I think some people may not jump on board with this. And the key thing Nintendo has to figure out is, number one, like you said, is it going to be the building Roblox Minecraft aspect of this that really gets marketed and grabs a hold of the younger audience? And number two, is this going to be a game that is something that people that didn't like Breath of the Wild are going to embrace and say, look, this game's really, really good? I think there's a lot of unknowns there, but I'm gonna give you my take, and I think it's gonna get close, but it's not gonna make it. I could be wrong, but I want to hear your take on this.
Ultimately, I agree with your conclusion. It's going to fall short.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking it's going to come in around 23 to 25 million once this generation comes to a wrap.
That's the hard part, isn't it? I think it's going to come out of the gate selling really, really
Yeah,
well, maybe
huge
better than Breath of the
numbers.
Wild. But it's just
Yes.
that middle and that tail that is concerning,
Mhm.
because we know that there is something else around the corner. There is new hardware approaching. There is something coming, right?
Mhm.
Again, not going to be anytime soon, probably not this year. But we know that Nintendo is working on whatever's next. And I wonder how that's
Right.
going to translate into sales numbers for Tears of the Kingdom.
Right. And that's where like I come in with those figures, assuming there's going to be a drop off due to the price. There's going to be a drop off due to just lack of interest. And also countering some of that with the Roblox Minecraft potential. It's far from a guarantee that element is going to lure in some of that audience. And
Yep.
that there's not already some of that audience interested in the Zelda game. So there'd be overlap there. But I think if it can come in, 22.5 to 25 million units, I mean, it's a monster success.
Oh yeah.
It's nothing to sneeze at.
Definitely not.
I just don't think this is going to be the title that bucks the trend of outselling its predecessor on the same generation when it comes to Zelda games. It's doing new things, but ultimately, based on what we know at the moment,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's doing enough to appeal to those traditionalists who have moved on from Zelda for the time being.
Yeah.
And that's where I don't think that new audience that it could bring in is going to offset those who have moved on completely.
It's a really good point too. And part of me wonders why they didn't hold this game back for new hardware and have that as a launch game, which they could, right? We've seen it happen with the Wii U.
Remaster
but
it.
like, I also feel like, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is something that I always had planned for on the Switch. And whatever comes next on new hardware, whatever Zelda game, will be I don't want to say a radical departure, but it'll be a different type of game again. And they'll come up with something new and unique and interesting and cool, which is, I think, is the right move.
I mean, that's going to be the interesting thing, is that you're going to use, just for generalization, the same high rule in these two games. So now when it comes time for the next new 3D Zelda game, are you going to have a radical departure? Are you going to return to the norm, which are, those traditional 3D Zelda games? What direction do you take? Do we get another Breath of the Wild moment? It's going to be interesting what the future holds for the franchise, because up to earlier this year, you definitely had people saying, well, this just looks like Breath of the Wild 2. There's nothing unique about it. It took until we saw the Ultra Hand and all those other mechanics to say, this is the differentiating feature that separates it from Breath of the Wild and makes it its own thing. So Nintendo can always surprise with a new game mechanic. And,
of course, yeah.
That's what makes Nintendo interesting. You never know how they're going to surprise.
I can't wait. But I definitely want to, revisit this once we are playing the game and maybe chat about, how well we like the game and how well it's doing and everything like that. I can't wait for the game to come out. I'm very excited to play.
Yeah, and just about, potentially maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, we will have that preliminary sales data in. And we can revisit it, see if our initial estimates were way off, if we came in too high, too low, and maybe readjust our forecast slightly or stand by them. But we can definitely revisit that later this month.
Yep.
And with that, we pivot to some Streamlabs questions that we have accumulated.
I'm sorry, Streamlabs people. We'll get caught up.
We will. That is a guarantee. And our first one comes from Fangs the Wolf, who donated $5, and they write, "Hi, Nate and MVG. With Disney remastering their back catalog as of late with additions such as classic Star Wars games, Aladdin, Gargoyles, and Zombies Ate My Neighbors, should we assume there will be even more Disney ports in the future?" I mean, I would definitely say the future is brimming with possibility.
Is that a hint? Brimming? Is that a game? Is there some kind of game?
It?
I don't know.
Oh, I hope not.
I think there will be. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, why do we not have DuckTales on the Switch?
Right? That's a good question. That game got delisted though, so maybe there's some weird thing there going on.
It's such a good fit for the Switch, though.
Oh, it's a perfect Switch game. Needs to be on the hardware.
I don't care if they got the well, the original version was what, Genesis?
I think so.
Put it on NSO.
Yeah,
I just want to hear the moon theme.
that'd be cool.
Then had a $1 donation from Jackie G. And they write, always terrific to listen to a new episode from you. My question for you this time. Do you think the transitional period to the next Switch will be longer than usual this time, more so in regards to cross-generation releases between the two?
Oh my God. A hard question to answer.
It's difficult to answer only because, if we're going to operate under the assumption of cross-generation releases between the two, and you're suggesting that backwards compatibility is a 100% surefire thing, then the overlap between the hardware could last a couple of years. It's entirely dependent on those types of features. If this is a clean break, like Wii U to Switch, for whatever reason, there's just no backwards compatibility for some sort, then the cutoff is going to be probably more in line what we've seen from Nintendo in previous generations, like Wii U to Switch, even GameCube to Wii, where they just kind of get to that hard end and say, we're done with that prior platform. Might still manufacture it to sell because of evergreen software, but we're not going to sell or bring major releases or even mid-tier releases to the hardware anymore. I kind of feel as though Nintendo looked to that 3DS Switch overlap where they brought games like Metroid Samus Returns and Mario and Luigi to the 3DS well into 2017 and 2018, and kind of sat there and said, these games didn't sell. Maybe this isn't going to be something we do in the future. It all depends on how that market really responds, because you can look at, say, 3DS had a significant install base. These games should have sold, but people were ready to move on from that outdated hardware, and they were going to the new thing, which was the Switch. So even though you still had an active base and you brought some quality games, people didn't want to play them there anymore. So it's really hard to answer at the here and now. Then had a $10 donation from Lasagna Cat. This question is for MVG. In what ways is developing games for the Xbox, PlayStation, Switch, and PC different?
Well, they all have different SDKs, right? So even though architecturally 3 of those systems are the same, they all have their own SDKs and they all have their own graphics APIs that you have to consider. They all have their own social API. They all have their own, controller API. Some of them have haptics and HD rumble. Some of them don't. So I think that's the best way I can explain it. Like, that's why I always try to tell people that, especially those that are wondering why, and I don't want to get into this because this is a different conversation, but wondering why games don't appear on Xbox when they should be easy to port from PC. I think that's a narrative that is just incorrect, and there's so many different unique and quirky things about each system that you have to consider, and each one of them has to be treated on its own merits. So, the whole concept of ports and stuff like that is, I'm not saying it's complicated, but there's obviously a lot of things you have to consider, to bring any game to any piece of hardware.
Mm-hmm. We then had a $100 donation from the Zelda Sensei, whom this episode is dedicated to. No question. Then had a $10 donation from Duck1299, and they write, Nate and MVG, if it were up to you, what would be your software release strategy for Nintendo's next system? Would you go cross-gen with Switch and capitalize on the existing install base, or force a clean break and drive adoption of the new hardware?
God, I got in trouble for my video because people got mad at me because I suggested maybe they could take a clean break, because even though backward compatibility is something that everyone wants, in reality, when you have a new piece of hardware, no one wants to play old games anymore, right? I got to, people didn't like that take, right? And I get it, especially when you have an eShop account or a Nintendo account and you have a lot of digital purchases associated with it. That makes sense, right? Look, I think personally, again, this is a conversation we've had before, but I personally think that they will have specific cross-gen updates for a selection of games. I don't know what that will entail, but I think that's how they're going to solve for it.
If it were up to me, I would probably just do a clean break and drive adoption to new hardware, because depending on, how much more advanced the hardware that I am planning for my successor is, I don't want to deal with the whole cross-generation thing, because this isn't like a PS4 to a PS5,
right?
Where we also had like that pro middle ground. This is more like going from a Wii to a Wii U, potentially.
Yeah.
Depending on, where Nintendo lands in the power system for the successor. And I think it's easier just to say, let's leave it behind. And you also have to factor in, there are things like the game card technology. Could Nintendo go to a newer technology that may not be compatible with Switch, which I get, it technically isn't an issue in terms of software development, but it could just be one of those things of, we don't want to bother with it anymore.
Something that's more secure, that doesn't allow it to be easily dumped, because we've seen, obviously, there's a piracy scene, and also one that's cheaper to manufacture. I think those things, a 64 gigabyte cartridge shouldn't cost a nominal leg. It should be a lot cheaper to have bigger games, and we do expect bigger games on new hardware. I mean, that's just the nature of video games. So I agree with that.
And also, if I'm Nintendo, it's kind of one of those cases of, I'm fine with you buying that evergreen software as long as you want on that existing platform.
Exactly. And it's the Nintendo way. Like we just talked about it. Nintendo loves to sell you the same game again. And if there is a compelling reason to do so, then people are going to.
Right. And that's the thing.
If Tears of the Kingdom comes out on, I'm just going to say the Switch 2, but we don't know it's a Switch, right? I'm just going to use the word Switch 2 for now. And that version runs at 60 frames per second and has 1080p visuals. That looks a lot cleaner. Then that's enough for me to say, yeah, I'm going to double dip. I think a lot of people would. I mean,
that's the thing. There's a lot of factors to weigh. Ideally, from that business standpoint, you'd say, oh, let's do the cross-generation thing. I can still sell it to 130 million people and I can bring in new people on the hardware. But if I can force that clean break, there's also a lot of benefits from a business standpoint to consider. Then had a $1 donation from Norl Vanaru. Said, hey, Nate, can we be sure that there is anything new for Nier/Drakengard? Like anything, I know that they will try to make money on the Nier name eventually, but I mean sooner than later. Let's hope. That's really all I can say on that. Let's hope. I don't believe, that they're done with those franchises or anything, but, the games do take time to develop it. Well, let's hope an announcement is in the near future. I mean, ideally, maybe we got some sort of teaser in June, but I mean, that's definitely probably just hopium.
Yeah.
But, I definitely expect those franchises to get new entries. Then had a $1 donation from Jackie G, which that was a little out of date, but once the Activision deal is complete,
oh boy,
do you suspect that Xbox will start pushing mobile more throughout their whole gaming division? For example, making their console developers work on mobile games, including them in showcases, maybe.
I'll tell you what, Jackie G, we'll give you a $1 credit to ask another question. How about that?
That's fair. I mean, I think Microsoft definitely want to be in that mobile sector, because King was one of their focuses on that deal. They really wanted King, who is just king of mobile games. I don't think it would have came into, their showcases or anything like that, because Microsoft is very hands off. They would have let King just continue to operate as their own thing which is how they let Bethesda and ZeniMax operate, and that recently got them into some trouble.
Yes, it did.
And our final Streamlabs question for this episode comes from South Coast Horizon, who donated $3 and writes, can we chill out with all these expectations of any kind of sequel to the new Super Mario Brothers movie? I'm happy it's doing well in box office, but the sequel talk seems forced and unnecessary. Hearing talk of Star Fox or Zelda movie? How about a new game?
I agree with all that. I don't feel like there needs to be a universe, where we have all these movies come out, like the Marvel, universe, whatever. I think he's right.
Like there will be a sequel to the Mario movie. It has grossed over $1 billion now, and it's just natural that they were likely already planning a sequel, if not a trilogy of Mario movies. I think the idea, to your point of like a universe with a Zelda movie and a Star Fox movie and an Ice Climbers movie in the style of Everest and a Samus movie in the style of the Alien films. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think that stuff was ever even considered or on the table to begin with. I think Nintendo went to Illumination and said, hey, let's make this Mario movie. If it is a success, we'll do 1 or 2 sequels to it that they probably already had, like skeleton outlines of.
Right.
And just the basic premise that now they're looking at saying, okay, let's expand upon it. We had the credit teaser of what the sequel could introduce. And now that's being greenlit. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think they're sitting down saying, okay, what other franchises do you guys have that we can do? Like, I also think that would also include the Donkey Kong movie, because we've seen Nintendo focusing a lot on Donkey Kong. He's a pivotal character in the Mario Brothers movie. It's getting the expansion at the theme park. So I think the initial sit down was a couple more Mario movies and Donkey Kong. Maybe there's some preliminary talks of, do we want to do Zelda? Do we want to do some of our other franchises? But those are things that would be so far off in the future. We're talking 10 years at minimum. Absolutely. Before we would see anything come to light. The talk is way too premature at the moment.
Yep.
And that is the final Streamlabs question for this episode. If you'd like to support the channel, we have a Streamlabs link in our description below. Donate any dollar amount, ask a question. We will answer it at the end of the next episode. Donate $100 or more, and we will dedicate the episode to you. And with that, I'd like to thank MVG for joining me, as always.
Always a pleasure, Nate, and it's great to be back. Thanks for having me on.
And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give it a like if you didn't, give it a dislike, and let us know your thoughts in the comment section below about whether or not you think Tears of the Kingdom will outsell Breath of the Wild. And if you when you look at the historic trends, if you think there are any contributing factors beyond the ones we discussed that could potentially lead to higher sales or even significantly lower sales than what we have given our forecast on, in the comment section as well. And until next time, continue to embrace the hate.